After being laid off in 2014, Susan Rosenstein decided it was time to launch her entrepreneurial journey. 3 years later, she launched her podcast, Women in the Middle. She's now 7 years into her podcasting journey with over 350 episodes under her belt and over 1.7 million downloads. Her podcast has now become one of the main drivers of her business, with around 50% of her clients finding her through her podcast. In this episode, we cover how Suzy knew that podcasting was right for her and her business, tips on coming up with episode ideas and nailing down your ideal guest brief, how Suzy gets 50% of her clients through her podcast, secrets to staying consistent as a podcaster, why audio quality is essential for any podcast, a podcasting incident unlike anything you've heard before, and much, much more. Suzy knows her stuff when it comes to podcasting, and if you want to grow your show, don't miss this episode. Suzy, thank you for joining me on Podcasting Amplified. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. So Suzy Rosenstein hosts Women in the Middle. She's an MA and Master certified life coach, and she shares the good, the bad and the ugly, and sometimes downright hysterical about growing older and making the changes you want to make so you don't have regrets in your second chapter. So taking me back and our listeners back to 2017, so the podcast has been going for quite a long time now. Why did you start your podcast? Why did you decide that podcasting was the right format of content for your business and for you?
Yeah, I love that question. And I've thought a lot about it now that I've been doing it for a while. Back then, I got laid off in 2013, and I started training to become a coach in 2014. And the reason I share that is because, it was a big pivot for me. I turned 60, 50 then. I'm having a little trouble today focusing. I need another cup of coffee. So I turned 50 when all of this was going on. And so starting the podcast was 3 years in, at the very beginning of starting an online business. And when I think back to it now, it makes perfect sense that I was attracted to podcasting. Back then, I didn't know anything about it, and I considered myself really tech averse, and I was a late adopter to even having a smartphone. So I wasn't an avid podcast listener, but there was somebody in my community who had launched a podcast, and she was doing quite well, and I was really enjoying it. And when I think back to what I'm passionate about and things I'd always been attracted to, it was always audio. From playing with tape recorders, when I was in grade 3, I asked for a tape recorder as a gift. And because we were making commercials and, funny little spoof things and recording sounds of flushing the toilet, all kinds of childhood shenanigan type things. And then over time, I just was really attracted to radio, talk radio, listening to NPR. And when I moved to Canada, CBC, I just loved that kind of way of consuming information. I even have a gramophone. I'm just attracted to sound and recording. I don't consider myself a tech expert in any of that stuff, but I've just always been attracted to it. And then when I was in graduate school in the 80s, I became quite good at qualitative methodology and conducting long-form interviews. And when you do that, you're paying very close attention to the precise words that people are saying. You're really, really using your listening skills, and you're looking for patterns of speech, which ties in beautifully to the skills required for being a good podcast host, especially when you have guests. So it all makes sense to me now when I think about it. But when I made the decision, I chose it over video because I was just more comfortable, and I always enjoyed listening to radio shows in that format and stuff. So I think that's what happened for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't heard from another guest about, that kind of history that goes back to when you were a child and, having a tape recorder and that. So that's
recording toilet sounds.
Yeah.
Nobody else has talked about that.
And so you got laid off in, was it 2013, and started your business shortly after. So were you planning on starting a business before then, or was it kind of you had to think about what you wanted to do now?
Oh my gosh, Joe, here it comes. So I had been stuck and unhappy for 5 years,
Yeah.
and I didn't realize what the problem was. Now, in hindsight, having worked with midlife women for 10 years, I get it.
Mm.
It's very common to be stuck in midlife. It's a transition point. But I wasn't sure what I wanted. And I had some insight in that 5 year period, which for me was between 45 and 50, where I found myself in a needlepoint store. Now, I don't know that you've ever found yourself in a needlepoint store, but I was working on a couple of projects and I needed some help. If you go to a specialty store, there's always an owner that knows a lot and can help you. So I was getting some help. And as I was in there, I was just looking around, just going, wow, it's so beautiful in here. All the beautiful colored threads and women. I think it was all women in the store at that time. They were so committed and passionate about learning needlepoint. And I remember leaving the needlepoint that store, going back to work, and just thinking, why aren't I an entrepreneur? The woman who owned that needlepoint store, she figured it out. She loved it. Who knew you could make money from needlepoint? Like it never even occurred to me. I just wasn't part of the entrepreneurial scene seriously, although I had always dabbled as an entrepreneur, starting when I was 12, doing calligraphy and writing the beautiful lettering on envelopes and charging for that for weddings and things like that. So I didn't always think about it, but when I got laid off, it was so clear that I didn't have a good excuse not to anymore because I was too afraid to leave a job that looked good on paper. It seemed indulgent if I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and it seemed very risky going from a long-term job and a steady paycheck and all of that. But when I got laid off, it was the gift I couldn't give myself.
Mm.
And so I trained to be a coach. I wasn't sure at that point what I would be doing, but the more I got into it and the more exposed I got to online marketing, and that it was a really solid way to connect with people and to help people, I just dove in. That's what happened.
Great. And how has the podcast helped drive the business forward, or how has it affected the business?
Well, it's really been amazing for me, but it could always be better. So, with the entrepreneurial mind, you're always going, I should be farther than I am. So, I do
Yeah.
always think that. On the other hand, I have noticed that about 50% of the people who actually hire me have discovered me through the podcast.
Wow.
So, it's
50.
not anything you can really track at the front end of figuring out what's happening. But I do ask people when they come into my world, in my free Facebook group, how they found me. And so once that became clear, I realized that I needed to take podcasting more seriously and learn more. And even last year, I realized that I have taken lots of courses and studied with other coaches and experts in other areas of my business, but never podcasting. Yet it was the most successful thing I'd been doing.
Mm.
And I just didn't see it that way. The other thing that's been really great is it helps me think through ideas and formulate content. So a lot of times I'll test an idea and see what kind of response I get through the podcast, and then I'm able to see how it could be incorporated into my business more. Sometimes it's the other way too. Podcast listeners will give me ideas which are great, like what's on their mind and what they're looking forward to me talking about. But it definitely does that. It also gives me kind of a schedule to develop content. So, if left to your own devices, sometimes you don't feel like thinking deeply about this or that at a certain time. But the podcast schedule feels like a grind a lot of the time. And it does, on the plus side of the grind, it keeps you creating content and applying your special, unique lens to whatever it is you're talking about. And so, in that way, it's terrific. And then getting better and better at repurposing the content has been something I'm focusing on too, because once you have a podcast episode, you can easily turn it into other things, everything from a blog to a lesson in my signature program, to a challenge, to social media, to Pinterest pins, like all kinds of things.
And you said 50% of your clients come through from your podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't checked that in a year, but when I did check it last year, I was very surprised to notice that. Does
Mm.
that sound surprising to you?
Yeah, I mean, I know, for some businesses, their content, if they have a podcast, then that's their content. Then, yeah, they'd expect, a good proportion, but 50% is very impressive. And that, yeah, I can see how that shows you exactly where you need to put your time into.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'm this year because I am diving deeper into it, I really want to understand things in terms of my effort and results. So maybe we'll check back in a couple of months and we'll see where I'm at with that stat.
Yeah, yeah, and then 344 episodes later, at time of recording, is very impressive. You managed to keep up the consistency. Have there been any times where you felt like you've needed a break at all, and how did you push through those, if so?
That's a great question. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. First of all, I can't even believe it's been 344 episodes. I can't believe it. If only I could apply that kind of discipline and focus to other areas of my life, that would be great.
Mm,
For some reason, I've been able to do it. I care deeply about consistency, and people are counting on me. Like they are listening on purpose, and I love being there for them. So, are there times I need a break? Yes. The first time somebody told me, oh, you can do an encore episode, I felt a little bit like that was cheating, but that is my number one go-to, especially with a rich um, library of content. It's not hard for me to resurface something. And some of those earlier episodes, they're great, but they don't have a lot of listeners. So it's a great way to bring something up again. And you don't even need to feel bad about it if you love your content and if you've got a lot to choose from. So I have done that. Unfortunately, I have not yet been that successful with batching content, which I believe is a gold star standard for turning into a podcaster who's not tired of creating content. And then
yeah.
the other thing I didn't do because I wasn't aware of it was the approach using seasons. I think that approach is a really interesting idea because you can determine how large the season is, how much of a break you want. So it doesn't mean that I couldn't start doing seasons. It's funny when you look at the podcast, it says season one, 344 episodes. But I could have a season, that was 10 episodes or a series that was 10 episodes. There's other ways to do it. But, at the beginning in 2017, it was very early in my business and I didn't appreciate where my business would go, what kinds of things took time, what didn't take as much time, what kind of a flow I needed for my day, how much time it took to create content. So I really didn't know what I was doing. I just jumped in. But I would say yes, it does become a grind. If you can batch content, that's awesome. I just find sometimes, I don't know, it could be my age, it could just be the way my brain works. But if I were to record 4 episodes in a day, I wouldn't remember what little anecdotal stories I told and when. And
Mm.
already that's a problem. Sitting here talking to myself, whenever I'm on with clients or somebody who's been a listener and they jump on a call, I say, yep, this is the seat. I'm sitting right here and I'm talking to myself. I talk to myself for a living. And that's what it feels like sometimes. And I honestly don't remember if I've shared a story or a lesson sometimes in an episode, in a coaching call, anecdotally. I just find that when I batch content, they all kind of blend into one. So I know there's other ways I could do it. And in fact, I have a second podcast launching very soon called Women in the Middle Entrepreneurs. And I did get some guidance on that one to include more automation. And I am way ahead in that one. So it's going to launch, and I don't really need to look at it for a while because I've got people helping, all the content's there, and there's more automation in the email. So I know I can do it. And so once that thing gets launched, that amazing new podcast, I'm going to be using some of those techniques in the women in the middle so that I can make some of those same shifts and gains going forward.
Great. A lot of insight there for people who are struggling to keep up with, the roller coaster of content creation. And yeah, especially after you've been going for a few years, I'm sure there are plenty of listeners who haven't listened to your episodes from 7 years ago. So,
Right.
and I
And
guess,
you know,
yeah, sorry.
I'm working with the midlife folks, so
Mm,
sometimes they forget anyway.
yeah.
I know that's a broad sweeping generalization based on my experience, but a lot of times I love to hear something again. One of my most popular episodes is about maybe usually I'm speaking to other women. So Joe, I'm going to bring you into the land of the
Don't
midlife
worry
woman
about
here
it.
for a minute. For a minute, we're going to go in. But it was a really great blog and episode about old underwear.
Hmm.
And so what can tend to happen in a very busy life, that decades go by very quick, and all of a sudden you go to your underwear drawer and it's full of pathetic panties. And these panties aren't doing the job they're intended to do. They look bad, they feel bad. That was a very popular episode, and it was number 6. So I have resurfaced that one a little bit, and I've done other things with it. Like I mentioned, a blog, I've done a masterclass, I've done a challenge. And so that content keeps on ticking. And it happened this week. I get an email where somebody says, Suzy, I thought about you this week. I went into my underwear drawer and I threw out a couple of old ones, and it's great.
Yeah. And I guess you've also got, in terms of, keeping consistent, you've also got that flexibility of putting together a solo episode or an interview episode, because you do both. Do you follow a particular schedule for that, or does it depend on how much time you have, what guests are available, and so on?
Oh, Joe, you think I'm so organized. Um, I do not have a tight schedule, but generally speaking, I have about 50% interviews ish. Um, I find that my solo episodes have much higher listeners. There's more listeners for the solo episodes for sure. There's a few exceptions. If I have a high name, not a high name, a big name, somebody that is recognized by other people and have a following, then those episodes have a lot of listeners. But typically speaking, my solo episodes have more. Um, I am ahead on interviews. In fact, I think I have too many now, so I want to stop interviewing because, it takes a while for those interviews to come up. If I'm only having 1 to 2 guests a month, that's not that many spots a year. So it really is valuable real estate to get on a podcast that's doing well. It's in the top 1%. It goes between the top 1% and the top 0.5% globally. It waffles a little bit back and forth, but like I can't even believe that either.
Mm.
But yeah, it's about, I would say about half. And sometimes I sit down and I honestly don't know what I'm going to talk about. I sit right here, I look out the window, and I go, I look at there's a tree there. I ask the tree, what am I going to talk about? And then whenever I'm really stuck, I think back over the week to my coaching calls and what are the things that came up? What are the things that keep coming up? And that usually guides me. Sometimes I'll take just an immediate thought that I usually get in the shower and I'll go to Amazon and do a quick search and just see what are the titles of the books that are coming up on that topic. Or I'll do a quick Google search and then I only let myself look at it for like 2 seconds because I don't want to dive into what anybody's saying. I'll just quickly look at it and I'll go, oh, that's an idea. And then I just get rid of it and then just start to think. So I really look for inspiration like that. And I also go through my week and just think if anything funny happened, can I turn it into a lesson? So that's where I'm getting this stuff. Sometimes I, what's really interesting is sometimes it takes longer to do the interview episode than it does to just create one. When I create them, I do use a script. So I need to write the script and then I riff off the script. But I like to have that anchor. Um, with the interview, I may have interviewed them 3 months ago, so I need to re-listen to the episode and then create the summary notes from it. Sometimes there's something missing, like maybe the photo's not there, and then I have to go find it. Or, I just find that it's easier to be distracted sometimes going back in time versus something fresh where I'm just created. I forget the question you asked me, but that's kind of what happens with me.
Yeah, it's basically just about how you decide on whether to do solo episodes. And so you did answer it. And Yeah, it's interesting you say that you don't always know exactly what you're going to be talking about for the solo episodes, because I did listen to one of your solo episodes and it certainly didn't sound like, I mean, it's, you know, it sounded like you knew what you were talking about and that it was maybe was planned to an extent. And then you say for your interview episodes, you're scripting them. How scripted are they? Just the questions you're asking, you've planned them ahead, are you?
Well, the solo episodes are completely scripted. I write the whole thing
Okay.
word for word, like a paper in university.
Hmm.
But sometimes, I would say all the time, I may, and I'm good at reading them. They don't sound it because I'm riffing along the way, but I might finish a paragraph and then I'll just talk about something. So the whole thing isn't completely tied down, but the whole thing is written. I just add to it.
Okay.
And in terms of the questions for the guests, I have questions that are standard. So what I'm looking for in the women in the middle is is a transformational story from a woman who was stuck, confused, not feeling fulfilled. Something was off, and then how they figured out what it was they wanted and how they went for it, how they had the courage and confidence to go for it. So now they're happy and they're reflecting back. So I'm very interested in behavior change and courage, like how that happened because at one point they were unhappy and confused and then they got through it. So I really want to go pretty deep on that decision point and how the clarity came forward. So I don't know. That's pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
I want the story. So there's basic questions that they've answered in advance, and I there's no surprises in the arc of the interview, but when people are talking, it just can go anywhere. And I ask them in advance, is there something you don't want to discuss? And then I'm very curious. So I tell them, just like you told me that it's edited. So I say, I'm very curious. I'm going to ask questions. And if you flub or if there's anything that you don't like the direction we're going, just say pause and we'll take it the way you're interested in going.
And do you find it a challenge at all to find guests that have that transformational story, that, you know, where
No,
they're in the right place, or do they reach out to you a lot of the time?
you know what's happening, Joe, is I'm getting way too many pitches. I'm it's so many pitches and I'm not usually getting the the ideal guest from a pitch. A lot of people pitch the podcast thinking I'm just looking for experts to speak. And the majority of my guests are not experts that are just speaking. I want to hear the journey and the expertise, but a lot of the expertise is about themselves. It's like looking at their journey and we talk about it together. So very rarely I have an expert. Like if there's something very specific I want to know about, often I need to go find that guest. Like right now I'm looking for somebody to talk about birth order. I think birth order is fascinating. Nobody has spontaneously pitched me on that.
Mm.
I did a couple of episodes related to adoption. I'm very interested in that and step adoption, where you had one parent that was a birth parent, but there was a second marriage and the second parent adopted because that's something that happened to me. So I have done episodes like that, and I would say I'm very proud of my guests because I'm not just responding to pitches. Most of my guests have not just done the circuit of talking about or talking to midlife audiences. It's really a reflection of what I think is interesting and what I'm curious about. So if I'm on vacation, I love to go into places where I can meet artists or creative people. And I'm always asking questions. One time I went to a lavender farm. I love lavender. And I was across the country. I'm in Canada, so I was out west. And I started to talk to the owner, and I can just smell a transformational story. I knew this wasn't her passion from the beginning. And sure enough, that particular woman grew up on an apple orchard. And then there was a whole history of how she moved out east and how she was a teacher and then how she moved back and then eventually discovered after several crops discovered lavender. I'm really good. I think it's those listening skills. I'm just really good at sniffing out an interesting story of how people found their passion and had the courage to go for it. So that's happening all the time to me, where I'm just meeting somebody in an airport, and the next thing you know, they're on my podcast.
Yeah.
But like I said, on occasion, I do want a specific expert. Um, I had somebody who did pitch me about the topic of surrender, which was something I hadn't dealt with as a mindfulness coach. It's something that comes up, and I just hadn't dealt with it at all. I did have somebody pitch me, a lot of people pitch me about menopause, and I'm not a menopause expert. And I did want a doctor to specifically talk about some of the issues that come up with menopause. So sometimes I'm looking for something very specific as an expert, but most of the time I'm looking for the story. But I guess a lot of people, when they're pitching, if they've written a fictional book, I wouldn't be interested in that by itself. I would be interested if you never thought of yourself as a writer. How did you decide to write a book when you never thought of yourself as a writer? Just to pitch a fictional book, that wouldn't be appealing to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm mostly interested in the story, except if there's somebody very specific. I'm interviewing somebody today who's a sleep expert. Sleep comes up all the time in midlife. So I absolutely want to talk to her about her expertise related to sleep. And in the pre interview, I'll ask her, do you have a personal story? Most of us do. And then we got interested in, for whatever reason. So she may have a story to share. We'll see. But honestly, so many pitches, it's a lot. So that's one of the things I want to figure out a better system for, to close the loop sooner if they're not a good fit. And a lot of people also are working with experts to get on podcasts. So I need a better way to communicate with those people to tell them what I'm really looking for, what makes a really good guest. And I would say, I don't know about you, but I get a little frustrated when people haven't done their homework. Like if you're going to pitch a certain topic and all you needed to do was a quick search and see that over 6 years, I've talked about that 3 times, that's useful information to you,
Mm.
or men. I rarely have men on my podcast. I do, but not often. So you might want to understand that a little bit before you waste time pitching me and all the follow up. Does that happen with you?
Um, Not so much, not yet. Anyway, it's relatively early in the game before I've gotten a huge amount of sort of inbound, interview inquiries. A lot of, I mean, all my content before was just solo stuff, so it's not something I've had to deal with. But it's really good that you have a really clear idea of what makes a great guest, and not just who you want to speak to, but what makes a great guest for your ideal listener. And once you,
Yes, and I would
yeah,
like people who pitch to think about that too. And not
yeah,
just, I can tell sometimes people make a mistake when they're pitching me. They haven't edited the letter. So I can see who they've pitched just before, and I am looking usually for more of a unique story. However, sometimes I am looking for those bigger name guests who are doing the circuit, and it's amazing. And then in that case, I push myself to think what is the unique question or perspective that will come from me and my lens on the world that will make my interview with this person a little bit more unique to the women in the middle. So I
mm,
love that challenge. And it happened on the episode that's out this week. I had an amazing opportunity to interview the former CEO of Celebrity Cruises. And I, my passion is whale watching. And so I'm thinking, okay, this amazing woman that I can't wait to meet has spent almost 4 decades dealing with a business that exists on the water. And I know that she's seen some cool whale behavior. How can you not, spending that much time in that kind of industry? So I thought I'm going to talk to her about her favorite experience with whales. And I don't know that anybody else would think to ask her that question. I don't know, but it made perfect sense for me. I've done several episodes about how I express my passion and how I've incorporated it into my life. I've taken women on in a retreat kind of setting to do whale watching, and it just made perfect sense for me. And I was so excited she had the best answer. It was it was glorious. It was really, really, really fun.
Yeah. And you also said that your solo episodes, though, are normally more popular. Why do you think that is? Because there are a lot of variables there. There's the length
Yeah,
of the episode. There's the fact that it's just you. Have you got any insight from reviews or anything like that that can tell you more
yeah.
about those analytics?
I think it's one thing. I think it's sometimes people don't relate to the topic. I had one woman who I thought was unbelievably fascinating. She had me on her podcast, and I thought, wow, I want to have her on my podcast. But then she divulged something on my podcast because I was thinking about how she got to where she was. So I wanted to hear about the trajectory of her career. And in that story, she was a professional online gambler for a little piece of time. I'm like, wow, really? That was just so fascinating to me
Mm,
because, again, I'm always looking for how things piece together. I really believe as a life coach working with women trying to figure out their next chapter that you're already on the right path. You just don't see it. You don't see the connections, just like me with audio, and long form interviews that I got really good at in the 80s. People typically don't see it. So I was like, what can we learn from that? But what people saw in the title, the way I titled it, they're like, I'm not interested in gambling, for example. So sometimes it's the specific thing that they are focused on right now in their happiness. People are like, well, my husband didn't die. I'm not
mm,
divorced. I'm not trying to figure out online dating at 55. You know what I mean? So these are experiences that are relevant to many, but sometimes people are just like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's for me. I
okay.
think that's it, where the topics I choose are more general in nature.
Yeah. So in terms of the podcast growth, obviously you do want to get those downloads, but then I guess also the people who are listening to those interviews, they might, it might be really sort of transformational for them. They might get even more, even though you're getting less downloads. If somebody has, you know, been involved in gambling or anything like specific like that, then they'd get a huge amount of value from that episode.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't worry about it too much, but it did help me determine that for this particular podcast, I definitely want to keep doing solo episodes. On the new podcast that's coming out, it's all guests. Now, I I haven't thought about it. The intro episode, it didn't launch yet. Like I said, by the time people listen to this episode, it will probably be launched, unless you're gonna play this in 2 weeks. It's called the Women in the Middle Entrepreneurs, Women in the Middle Entrepreneurs. And right now, the format is all guests, except for my welcome episode, but it certainly doesn't have to be that way. I can always throw an episode in.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but right now, that's the way it is.
So I'm guessing your current audience, you feel that maybe it would put them off if you lean more into the entrepreneurial aspect. So is that why you've created a new podcast for a
Oh,
separate audience or?
that's a great question. No, I just noticed that a lot of my long-term clients are entrepreneurs. And the reason I started the podcast was that a lot of the guests on the Women in the Middle are entrepreneurs. They've made a shift, not all of them, but there are many, but a lot of my clients are entrepreneurs. And so there was a something that I didn't think was being addressed that needed to be addressed with entrepreneurs. And that is the intersection of midlife crap and trying to run your business the way you want to. So what happens in midlife, especially for women in midlife, is that there's a lot of responsibility and focus on some pretty big things going on with aging parents, with menopause, with your kids, making big decisions and leaving the house and then coming back, like the whole empty nest thing. There's a lot going on. These are just a couple of examples. And the way it affects business as an entrepreneur, when you don't have sick days and you can't just say, wow, my mother needs me right now and she's 2,000 miles away. What am I going to do? There's all kinds of stuff that happens. And as an entrepreneur, you might be more flexible and more portable, and it's still very challenging. So we're taking a close look at what kind of midlife hiccups, or, I'm putting it in quotes, midlife um, crises, or big giant things that have been going on as a result of your age and stage of life, and how it affects you as a woman entrepreneur trying to run your business and be successful according to your plan to do so, and how you are overcoming that. How are you dealing with it? What kind of systems are you putting in place? So that is the little piece that wasn't really being addressed on my current podcast. And it's been fantastic to talk about and really put a spotlight on it in this upcoming podcast.
Okay. And is that also going to be a weekly podcast?
It's going to be twice a week.
Oh, wow. Okay. And
Yes.
so you've talked about the automation side of things. Could you talk a little bit more about what you're doing with automation and how you're hoping to keep on top of both podcasts once it's launched?
Yes. So the main thing is that I got ahead on the second one.
Okay.
So remember, I still haven't sorted the automation on the first one, but I got ahead on the second one. So it is launching very soon. We're going to start with probably 20 episodes created. So already I'm ahead. And then there's a system put in place. So the first part of the system has to do with the front end. So when people apply, they are being prepped as to what I'm looking for. So they're watching a video at the beginning. Then they're invited to apply, and they're told that they may or may not be accepted. So they're told upfront. So they're asked to fill out an application knowing that they may not be accepted. And they're even booking an interview at that point. And then I review the applications once a week. So that's different, because on my other one, the interviews come in and I'm just dealing with it and feeling overwhelmed and not doing a great job. So even having that little bit of structure on when I'm reviewing applications is something I didn't currently have. And then they're part of an automated email system that helps them prepare for the interview. So the kinds of things that you sent me in terms of how to prepare, how to make sure that your mic works, that seems to be the biggest piece of advice that I think a lot of people don't appreciate the power of a good mic. And it's really important. Remember at the beginning of the COVID thing, when people were going on to Zoom who never had before?
Oh, yeah.
And the cameras and the mics were terrible. And even if you're not a professional broadcaster, even if you don't have a podcast, I would still advise anybody listening, get a good mic. It will change everything for you. So that part of the automation, it's just all taken care of then. And then after the interview, there's also some follow-up stuff that goes out automatically. But after the podcast is launched, I'm going to have to add some new things on how I follow up with them about the launch date. But it's just more handled. It's very clear what people are expecting, and they will know, very soon, because I'm reviewing them weekly, whether or not they're a good candidate for this podcast. That's the main thing.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, that's some good inspiration for anyone struggling with their interview scheduling and everything. So thank you. Yeah, I completely agree what you're talking about, audio quality and mics and everything. That's my background. And I can tell listening to your podcast that you have put the effort in there, because the audio quality is sounding good. So what mic do you use then?
Oh, I wrote that down because I thought you might ask that.
Okay,
Let me just look at my note here. Here it is. I use Audio Technica ATR 2100.
great.
And at the very beginning, when I launched Women in the Middle, I did work with somebody who had like a podcast launch coaching package. And that's what he recommended. And I worked with him to pick the music, the narrator, and the equipment. And we did the first 3 episodes together, and it was amazing.
Yeah, that's the exact mic that we recommend. So,
Oh, really? And you
yeah.
know what else, Joe? I can't listen to an episode that has a poor mic. I can't listen.
Mm. Yeah, and I don't think some people don't realize just how many people there are, even if it's subconscious, that they'll start listening for 5-10 minutes, and if the audio quality is terrible, it just gives them that idea that maybe the speaker isn't putting in the effort, or it's just, there are so many other podcasts out there that do offer the higher production values, so it is important.
Yeah, agreed.
And just finishing things up, I just wanted to ask if there was something that you wish you'd known back in 2017 that would have made this whole process a lot easier for you. What would it have been?
Yes. I think well, I actually had 2 things. One of them I mentioned already. I don't know if there's anything I could have done to learn how to batch or create seasons. I think that would have made a huge difference. Maybe seasons. That's one thing. And the other thing is SEO and keywords. And I find that most people who are not, you know, making millions in the online space, so many people don't know enough about SEO and keywords. I don't know enough about SEO and keywords, but I know enough to pay attention to using something
Mm-hmm.
intentional in the title. And I just find the more people I talk to about podcasting, the newer people, they aren't paying enough attention to that in terms of how Google's going to treat what it is you're putting out there and all kinds of searching. So again, I am certainly not an expert, but I am trying to pay more attention to it now. And for the first few years, I didn't pay any attention to it.
Yeah. No, that's very good advice. I think there are still a lot of podcasts out there, interview podcasts, where the title will just be the name of the guest, and that's it. And it's like there's no way that's going to end up in search unless you know the 1% of your listener base that might know the guest. But other than that, and if anyone wants some inspiration, if they are using just the guest name, then have a look at Women in the Middle, because even though you say you're not an expert, I think if you can get sort of 80% there, and then that's going to make the biggest difference.
So Joe, I don't know if you were going to ask me this, but in your pre-notes, I wanted to share if there's time.
Yeah, of
You asked
course.
me what one of the more memorable things was that happened in my podcasting career so far.
I'd love to hear it.
Okay, I have a good one and a weird one. Ready?
Go for it.
Okay, one of the good ones, but you don't sound like you grew up in the States. Are you in England?
Yeah, about an hour drive from London.
Okay. So in growing up, and you also look a lot younger than I am, but there was somebody very famous that I and other women my age grew up with on television. And her name was Joan London. And she was a well-known television broadcaster. She hosted one of the very, very popular morning news shows called Good Morning America. For 20 years, she was the host that went to the Olympics and interviewed presidents, and everybody knew her. She was on the cover of People magazine and whatever. So she wrote a book about turning 70, and she reached out, and I had the opportunity to interview her. I was so nervous because all of a sudden she pops up on my Zoom square. Somebody that I grew up with, who I grew up with, thinking of her as America's mom. That's how people thought of her growing up. What a treat it was. She was an amazing guest. She had amazing stories to tell. And I would have never had that opportunity if I didn't, dive into podcasting. So that was a really cool story. And then the weirdest thing that ever happened to me while recording a podcast happened this recently, maybe 6 months ago, and I decided to leave it in the episode when I put it out. And so here I am. I got the window right here, and I back onto a ravine. And I have this guest, and she's fascinating. And we're interviewing away, and all of a sudden I hear a giant crash, like bang crash. It sounded like an airplane part went through the ceiling or something. It was so loud and jarring. And I looked out, and what happened was a big hawk, like a massive hawk, crashed into my window. And I saw the hawk laying on the ground, kind of stunned. And I know because I do have small birds that hit my window sometimes, and I do all kinds of things to prevent the bird strikes. But I'm like, oh my God, I left the microphone running. I said, a hawk, and I was going to run out. And if you right the bird, like if the bird's on the back, if you turn them over, apparently that helps. Anyway, as I started to move, the bird moved, regained consciousness, and went up into a tree. So now the bird is sitting there. Another minute goes by, and then the bird flew away. And I just thought, oh, that was so startling. And I said to the woman I was interviewing, I'm so sorry. That was so disruptive. I can't even remember what we were talking about. And she says, oh, it's okay, Suzy. I've actually put out several blogs on green design in buildings, and this is how you can prevent bird strikes in the future. She knew all about it. I thought it was crazy. So when I put it out, I just left it in, and I explained it in the intro that the weirdest thing that ever happened to me while recording happened on this episode. So people tend to like to see all the little weird things going on behind the scenes. I have a very large dog that walks in sometimes, and he's got slobber and he's asking for food or something like that. They like that. I have a little bird that tweets. Sometimes I bang into the microphone. People like it. And I just make fun of it and just go with the flow.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'll edit out, coughs and sneezes and sirens outside. But when it's something that's going to get people talking and that's really quite shocking, that's the kind of thing you don't want that to happen specifically, but that's the kind of thing you want to leave in. And
Exactly.
yeah, listening to your story about effectively one of your dream guests, it's getting nervous for you just thinking about it. So
I was so nervous. It took me about half of the interview to calm down. And then I don't know that any listener would notice it, but I could tell that I relaxed and it got easier to talk to her. But yeah, I had her on a pedestal, and I read that book, and it was funny. Like, she made me laugh out loud, and she was such a polished guest. It was so easy to work with her because she was, she'd been in the business forever. It was amazing.
Well, that's a really nice place to finish. So thank you for sharing those stories, Suzy.
So welcome.
And for any women in particular in the second half of their life or approaching, then Women in the Middle, search it on your favorite podcast platform and take a listen. And is there anywhere people can reach out to you, Suzy, and connect with you?
Yeah, I have a freebie that they I think will really like. It's the top 12 episodes that talk about all these secrets of how you can fall in love with your life again. So the main stuff that when you're stuck and you don't know how to bust through your midlife funk, these top 12 episodes really give you a sense of how to do that and kind of behind the scenes scoop on how to really move it forward. And you can grab that at freepodcastbundle.com. Freepodcastbundle.com. That'll get you on a mailing list. Otherwise, you can just head over to my website at suzyrosenstein.com.
Cool. Leave those links in the description. And even if you're not a woman in your midlife, it's worth taking a look at Suzy's podcast, especially if you're just starting or you have an interview podcast. There's plenty of inspiration there, and there's a reason why Suzy's made it to 7 years and 344 episodes. By the time this comes out, it'll be closer to 350, I think. But
wow. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I do have men who are listening, that's for sure. So cool. You just gotta when I think about sharing some of these personal stories, I'm always like, ooh, I don't know, just like you, like I shared that whole underwear thing. I'm like, I hope you can handle it.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again for joining me and giving up your time, Suzy.
Thanks, Joe. It was really great to meet you.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.